I understand the wording, you know, simplification, deregulation. We don't want to deregulate. I agree, but let's keep in mind the fact that if we want to finance innovation, we have to take some risks. Measured risks. I do not speak about the unknown. I say simply that we should work together to find the best way to take risks, to innovate and create value in Europe. My last point about funding is simply to mention a question which is worth discussing today in Frankfurt, is financial innovation. What I see in the United States, massive changes. And I shall mention very briefly 2 points you know very well: stable coins, private credit, private equity. All of this didn't exist 20 years ago. When I was younger, didn't exist, was never mentioned here. But step by step, it's becoming sizable in the United States. And okay, so we need to look at this. Banks are part of the story, should be part, but not only. And we see a new non-banking sector appearing, developing, but interacting with the banking sector. There are close links. It's not, I'm used to saying that about private credit, they are both competitors and clients. Of course they are. But this is new. It is coming to Europe. It is big in the United States, it's coming to Europe and coming to Frankfurt. And these are discussions we need to have together with the official sector, with the central bank, with the supervisor, with the EU Commission, to understand what it means, what are the impacts, and what we want to do. How do we want to shape our funding system in Europe? I stop here. I've already been too long. I know the organizers are not happy, but they have made a mistake. They have given me the floor. Wish you a good day.
Thank you very much to Jean Lemierre, and of course setting out there a number of points that we will be picking up in our further discussions this morning. At the outset of his remarks, he indirectly referenced one quite notable outside impetus for investing in Europe, namely that which was delivered in April on Liberation Day, which triggered a significant flow of capital into euro-denominated assets. Yet, our next speaker recently pointed out that passive safe haven inflows can have a downside, and said that it is imperative that Europe shapes its own monetary and economic destiny. Let us hear more now from a welcome returning speaker, the President of the European Central Bank, Christine Lagarde. It is wonderful to have you with us again. The floor is yours.
Dear Lord Mayor, dear Mike, dear co-host of the Frankfurt European Banking Congress, esteemed guests from the financial sector and beyond, I would like to start, as I occasionally do, with reading for you a quote. It goes that way. The world around us does not stand still. In recent years, the global environment has been transformed in ways that none of us could have imagined. We have seen the post-war global order fracturing, the rise of new and some old powers, rapid changes in technology, and an uncertain outlook for global trade and finance. Sounds familiar? It should. Because I'm just quoting myself. And that was here 6 years ago, November 2019. And November 2019 was before the use of AI, or the rise of AI. It had been launched, but ChatGPT was a teeny tiny little thing that nobody really knew about. It was before the re-election of President Trump and his projects. It was before the unjustifiable, brutal invasion of Ukraine. And it was before COVID. And yet. So in that speech, what did I do? Bettina, you're right. I urged Europe to recognize that its old growth model, built on export-led growth, was coming under strain. And I called for a shift to focus instead on developing our domestic economy. And when I use domestic, I talk about Europe. Our domestic economy as a source of resilience in an uncertain world. And my point was not, if you remember, to argue for protectionism or inward-looking policies. It was about realism. It was about recognizing that the world was as it is and not as it was. And it was about acknowledging that the solution was already in front of us, and Jean, you alluded to it, the untapped potential of our own internal market. 6 years on, a lot has happened, but the diagnosis that we had back in 2019 has become just clearer, stronger, and more urgent. Europe has become more vulnerable, also due to our blatant dependency on third countries for our security and for the supply of critical raw materials. Global shocks have intensified with rising US tariffs, Russian aggression, and stiffening competition from China, to name a few. And at the same time, during the same period, our domestic internal market has stood still, especially in the areas that will shape future growth: digital technology, artificial intelligence, and in the areas that finance these shaping growth sources, our capital market. And as Galileo said, yet it moves. Europe continues to show resilience, revealing sources of strength that could grow if only we allowed them to do it. So the two questions that I would like to discuss today is, number one, how do we move from being vulnerable yet resilient to being strong? And what will it take to achieve this goal? And I think we have what it takes, and it is not as complicated as we think it is when we bash our head against the walls of complexity in Europe. More on that later. So let's look at the vulnerabilities that you all know about, but I'm going to try to give you some specific examples so that it gives credit to the ECB research and our staff, which is working hard on those issues. So those vulnerabilities stem from having built a growth model around a world that is gradually disappearing under our eyes. We embraced globalization more than anyone else in the world. Well, China probably embraced it a bit more than we did, but in the advanced economies, certainly we were the most advanced. In the 2 decades before the pandemic, external trade as a share of GDP almost doubled in the European Union. It didn't move an inch in the US. And this deep integration brought significant benefits. The number of jobs supported by EU exports rose by 75%, reaching almost 40 million people working for export. And for many years, this was a great source of resilience. But today, that same openness that we celebrated for 2 decades has become a vulnerability. Exports have become a far less reliable engine of growth, reflecting the changing global landscape. Just recently, because we have seen amplification of most phenomena that were in the works for a long time. In mid-2023, for instance, the ECB expected exports to grow by around 8% by mid-2025. You have the same numbers coming out from the WTO. In reality, they have not grown at all. And looking ahead, exports are projected to actually subtract from growth over the next 2 years. This has been felt more acutely in those countries that relied more on that export model and that were active, in particular, in those manufacturing sectors that were export-driven. As a result, growth across the euro area has become more uneven. At the same time, this export-led growth model has resulted in persistent current account surplus, increasing our reliance on other countries to generate our wealth, especially to the United States. Euro area residents hold nearly 10% of their total equity portfolio investment in US stocks, totaling 6.5 trillion, about twice the amount that they held back in 2015. Why? Well, this has been a very rational response by the Europeans, because US markets have delivered returns that were roughly 5 times higher than Europe's returns since 2000. But it has created, as a result, a vicious circle. As US markets channel European savings into high productivity sectors, the performance gap between our economies, Europe and the United States, widens, prompting yet more Europeans to channel their savings across the Atlantic. The result is stagnating productivity at home and growing dependence on others. Finally, we now face a new form of vulnerability, not just us, we share it with others, which is the weaponization of dependencies on key raw materials and technology. Our analysis at the ECB is that 80% of large euro area firms are no more than 3 intermediaries away from a Chinese rare earth supplier. Recent supply shocks, for example, the shortage of automotive chips or the threat of it, have shown how a single choke point can stall entire sectors, the automotive industry, notably. Now, these vulnerabilities do not trigger massive, dramatic crisis. Instead, they quietly erode growth as each new shock nudges us into a slightly lower trajectory. And over time, the cumulative effect of this lost growth and lost productivity become material. That's for the vulnerabilities, and we are all saddened by this state of affairs. And yet, as Jean indicated, we are resilient. And I'm going to borrow from him and go a little deeper in some examples without taking too much time, I hope. Because 2025 has exposed Europe's latent strength. Our experience this year has shown that a resilient domestic economy can shield Europe against global turbulence. And I will mention 3 sources of domestic strength that have helped cushion the shocks that we've suffered. I will quote, just like Jean, people, our potential, and our policies. I have to do that, right? But first, our people. We have benefited from an unusually strong labor market, one that has remained remarkably resilient even as growth has slowed. Typically, employment tends to grow at roughly half the pace of real GDP growth. And yet, since the end of the pandemic, that relationship has been almost, not half, but 1-to-1 in Europe. And this strength has created a virtuous circle. Rising employment, participation has increased as unemployment has reduced, but rising employment has supported consumption, which in turn has sustained services in particular, and created even more jobs, particularly in labor-intensive sectors. And all of that despite an aging phenomenon that is very specific to the advanced economies, but particularly acute in Europe, and immigration, which is a polarizing and dividing phenomenon. People. Second, our potential. Despite the notion that Europe is lagging behind in AI, European firms are moving quickly through the digital transition. and that is making investment more resilient to global uncertainty. Yet, we are resilient. And I'm going to borrow from him and go a little deeper in some examples without taking too much time, I hope. Because 2025 has exposed Europe's latent strength. Our experience this year has shown that a resilient domestic economy can shield Europe against global turbulence. And I will mention three sources of domestic strength that have helped cushion the shocks that we've suffered. I will quote just like Jean: people, our potential, and our policies. I have to do that, right? But first, our people. We have benefited from an unusually strong labor market, one that has remained remarkably resilient even as growth has slowed. Typically, employment tends to grow at roughly half the pace of real GDP growth. And yet, since the end of the pandemic, that relationship has been almost, not half, but 1-to-1 in Europe. And this strength has created a virtuous circle. Rising employment, participation has increased as unemployment has reduced, but rising employment has supported consumption, which in turn has sustained services in particular, and created even more jobs, particularly in labor-intensive sectors. And all of that despite an aging phenomenon that is very specific to the advanced economies, but particularly acute in Europe, and immigration, which is a polarizing and dividing phenomenon. People. Second, our potential. Despite the notion that Europe is lagging behind in AI, European firms are moving quickly through the digital transition, and that is making investment more resilient to global uncertainty. And while tangible investment has reduced in the past 2 years, as manufacturing has weakened, intangible investment has risen sharply, keeping overall business investment broadly stable. Firms continue to invest in AI and digital infrastructure because for any company that wants to survive, this is just not optional. People, potential, policies. Fiscal policy, in particular, has acted counter-cyclically, buffering the economy rather than amplifying downturns, as happened after the financial crisis. The fiscal packages now being implemented for defense and infrastructure, especially here in Germany, are coming at the right time for Europe and will have a measurable effect on growth. It has to be done and implemented. ECB staff estimate that higher government investment between now and 27, so over 2 years, will offset around 1/3 of the trade shock that we are suffering. Keep that number in mind, 1/3, because I'll come back to it later. Monetary policy. The ECB is also playing its part by delivering price stability. A few years back, we were talking a lot more about inflation and interest rates. I haven't heard anything yet. We have cut interest rates by 200 basis points from their peak, and this is increasingly feeding through into easier financing conditions, which is helpful to support demand. We will continue to adjust our policy as needed to ensure that inflation remains at our target. So together, these three sources of resilience will help anchor growth at home. Domestic demand is set to become.
La presidenta del Banco Central Europeo advirtiendo muchos riesgos sobre la inteligencia artificial, sobre las tierras raras y cómo puede perjudicar a la cadena de suministro de la industria automotriz, y reconociendo que Europa es vulnerable por su dependencia de terceros. Una Christine Lagarde que ha reiterado la postura del Banco Central Europeo de mantener sin cambios ya por 3 reuniones consecutivas los tipos de interés, actualmente en ese rango del 2%, de momento guardándose alguna bala en la recámara ante posibles disrupciones en la cadena de suministros o el impacto potencial de los aranceles de Donald Trump, sin descartar efectos de segunda ronda en la inflación, que de momento está bastante contenida, con algunas de las principales economías de la zona euro, como Francia, como Italia, por debajo de ese 2% que se fija como objetivo el Banco Central Europeo. Una Christine Lagarde que, bueno, ha dicho que incluso hace 6 años ya advirtió a la Unión Europea sobre su modelo de crecimiento anticuado, como lo oyen. Dice que ya advirtió a las autoridades europeas que algo había que cambiar, porque en la mano del Banco Central Europeo está el mandato de la estabilización de precios y también las decisiones de política monetaria. Una Christine Lagarde que también advertía que la apertura de nuestra fortaleza durante 2 décadas, dice, se ha convertido en una vulnerabilidad. Ya no se salva ni la pujante industria aeronáutica ni la sólida industria automotriz, porque ahora hay muchos jugadores, y habla incluso de un solo punto. Dice un solo punto de estrangulamiento puede paralizar la industria automotriz, en una clara, parece, alusión a las tierras raras. Vamos a seguir escuchando a Christine Lagarde.
Exposes how much potential Europe continues to leave untapped. Today, despite more than 30 years of the single market, intra-EU trade barriers in key areas remain too high. So you might remember the analysis that was conducted by the IMF about 2 years ago that indicated that services were prevented from circulating within the single market, and that was the equivalent of about 110% of tariffs, and the same for goods, about 40% of tariffs. And everybody at the time said, oh, this is a questionable piece of research. So I asked my teams at the ECB to just go a little deeper into it to see whether it was questionable or not questionable, because I was quoting those numbers from my previous place. Well, they did thorough work on this, and the analysis that they produced is that internal barriers in services and goods markets are equivalent to tariff of around 100% for services, so slightly less than the IMF research, and 65% for goods, a little more than the 40% of the IMF. This is what we produce and that we inflict on ourselves. Now, let's be realistic again. We should not expect those barriers to disappear all of a sudden. Why is that? Because not all products are equally tradable, because not all professions are the same, and because national and cultural preferences will continue to play a role in Europe, because Europe is based on diversity. Policy can reduce certain frictions. It's not going to eliminate them entirely. But we should expect at least 2 things. First, that barriers are low enough for the sectors that will shape future growth to operate in a truly European market. And this is clearly not the case, in particular for digital services, which will drive future innovation. And this is certainly not yet the case for capital markets, which must finance it. The second expectation that we should have is that being inside the single market, part of the club, offers a clear advantage over being outside the single market. In other words, that internal barriers are lower than external ones. But this is also not currently the case for services. Barriers to cross-border trade within Europe have been declining just as much as the barriers to operating from outside into Europe. So this helps explain why, even though services now account for 3/4 of Europe's economy, intra-EU trade in services makes up only about 1/6 of our GDP, which is roughly the same as our trade in services with the rest of the world. There is no competitive advantage to actually providing services within Europe. So this is a colossal waste of potential, especially at a time when we must rely more on ourselves than on others. And the key point is that achieving these gains does not require radical changes. I know exactly what some of you think. Oh, it's going to require treaty change. It's going to require massive political push. You might be right on the latter, not right on the first. Our analysis shows that if all EU countries were to lower their internal barriers only to the level of that of the Netherlands, internal barriers could fall by about 8 percentage points for goods and 9 percentage points for services. I don't pretend that the Netherlands is the panacea for everything, but their barriers are significantly lower than most of the other EU members. So remember, 8% for goods, 9% for services. And if we were to only do a quarter of that, that would be enough to boost internal trade enough to fully, not a third. Remember what I said about the investment over 2 years in military and infrastructure that would offset 1/3 of the trade impact that we're suffering as a result of tariffs? That, only a quarter, would offset the entire consequences of the tariff shocks that we are suffering. So the real question, and that's really getting to the beef of the matter, is why are we not taking those steps? And I'm going to point to one particular area. Others might argue that it requires a cultural shift, that it requires a political mega change. I'm just going to focus on 3 governance avenues that are available and that should be used. So the first one that I will use is harmonization of national law and regulations. We should understand that this is neither realistic nor even necessary. But we need the tools to go in that direction without reshuffling everything or without treaty change. And the first one that I would mention is to revive the principle of mutual recognition. It was the very engine of liberalization that powered the single market in the 1980s. What is mutual recognition? Well, it means very simply that if a product or a service or a profession is lawfully provided or practiced in one member state, it should be allowed to circulate freely across the European Union without the need to comply again with every other country's rule. If we look at financial services, today, banks already benefit from a passporting system, which means that a single license granted by the ECB enables them to provide services across Europe. But they will face different rules in foundational elements of the framework they operate in. And we have to appreciate that completing the banking union, deepening our capital market, and there are really good proposals coming out of the Commission that will be, I think, disclosed formally in early December. Deepening that capital market, harmonizing supervision would therefore be transformative, accelerating the path towards a truly integrated home market. The same logic applies to digital economy. Just as passporting embodies mutual recognition, the mutual recognition of digital identities, trust services, and other credentials would dramatically improve interoperability and eliminate hidden costs that slow the growth of Europe's digital markets. So that's step number 1, mutual recognition, taken one level higher, not just the recognition of professions around Europe, but going deeper into what is the backbone of the economies of the future that will drive our growth. The second step, and I'm taking you a little bit further into the difficulty of it, is to streamline the decision-making. By doing what? By extending qualified majority voting to areas on which Europe's future growth depends. Qualified majority voting has always existed within a certain perimeter, and it's been instrumental in driving integration, but it has now reached the limit of this perimeter. In several critical fields, the continued requirements for unanimity in the European Council still prevent meaningful progress towards completing the single market. What comes to mind? Taxation. Taxation is a clear example. You know, I've been sharing those meetings of finance minister when we try to move forward into some degree of harmonization of either the corporate tax base or the VAT. Well, reforms such as harmonizing VAT rules or establishing this consolidated corporate tax basis remain stuck because of national vetoes. Not so many of them, but national vetoes, one is enough. leaving firms to navigate a maze of fragmented tax regimes. That fragmentation is particularly damageable in a world of digital business models, which rely predominantly on intangible assets. Because clearly, national tax policies are pretty important to actually help out in respect of those entities and those elements of value. I'll give you an example. If a digital platform provides cloud or software services across Europe, it must currently comply with 27 different VAT systems, each with its own definition of where value is created for tax purposes. Now, I'm a former lawyer. I was in private practice for 25 years. This is a minefield for tax lawyers. They love it. But it's an expensive business to run. And as a result of that, it favors those that can afford the assessment of the 27 different regimes. And as a result, the tailoring of the products that they sell. The large one can absorb the cost. The small, medium-sized companies, not necessarily. And this is exactly not what Europe should want if it wants to nurture its own digital industry. Much talk about the European cloud, and I'm delighted to see that there are joint ventures now being blessed between France and Europe in that and Germany in that respect, but there are major obstacles. So moving to qualified majority voting using what is called the passerelle clause where necessary, which allows the European Council to shift specific areas from unanimity to majority voting without changing the treaties, could actually help break this deadlock. And to break the deadlock, you actually need unanimity. But to get that is a matter of trade-off between the member states. And it has been achieved in the past, and it can be achieved again. The third step, and this is my final one, is to take a more radical approach to simplification. And I do not mean trimming regulations through more omnibus proposals. And I'm delighted that those omnibus proposals are on the table and that there is movement in that respect. But the fastest way to achieve genuine simplification is not by repealing existing rules, which is an excruciating process, but, as advocated by Jean as well, by creating this 28th regime, which now finally the Commission really rallies behind. What are those 28 regimes? It's not, fantasy land. It exists. There are 28 regimes. Those are optional EU legal frameworks that sit alongside rather than replace national law. They coexist. They actually compete, for that matter. These frameworks would allow firms to opt into a single European rulebook in specific areas. As Jean mentioned, single rulebook has moved forward and certainly the needle has changed direction as a result. Prime candidate for that, obviously company law. And that is proposed in the Letta and Draghi report, both. A European company law regime would provide firms, in particular startups and scale-ups, but I contend not necessarily only startups and scale-ups, because I fear that we're going to see yet again the sort of complexity of Europe good intentions landing in how many employees, how much turnover, how many implantations here and where and whatever. Why not just be as simple as possible and let it open to any of those who want to opt for the special regime, the 28th regime? And as I said, this approach has worked before. There are 28 regimes. I'll mention two of them. The EU trademark from 1993, the community design, 2001, were both 28 regime offering optional EU-wide intellectual property title alongside with national laws. And both have been widely adopted, especially by firms active across multiple markets. That success shows how an optional EU framework can reduce fragmentation and even, as I said, generate some healthy competition between the systems. The European Commission is planning to come forward with the 28th regime proposal as part of its renewed and welcome ambition to set clear deadlines for removing barriers identified as the single market roadmap for 2028. But progress will depend on political will. I've been in both worlds, 25 years in the private sector, 20 years in the public sector. It requires the will, the energy of all. One cannot turn to the politicians or the policymakers or the technocrats or Brussels to say, over to you, you do the job. While the others are saying, well, we need help. It requires strong cooperation. And if I am to advocate one thing, it's that. Cooperation between both the public sector and the private sector, and a joint responsibility for which policies are prime priorities. And the first step does not have to be a big bang. It can be modest. Creating a digital business identity, giving firms a single trusted profile to register and operate online across the European Union, that could set a powerful precedent. If we get this right, firms that could grow based on genuinely European regime could also be best placed to access pan-European financing. You could establish the link between the two. So completing the single market in the real economy and in finance is a mutually reinforcing project, strengthening Europe's competitiveness, its capacity to invest in the future, and giving an incentive to those who are looking for returns in the United States to keep the money here and invest it here. I'll conclude now. The world is not waiting for us. And we have to decide how we can move forward and how fast we can move forward. If we make our single market really single and really simple, Europe's growth will no longer depend on the decisions of others, but on our own choices. This was my message 6 years ago. Today, that message has only grown more urgent. And what I've tried to do is identify avenues, areas where we don't need a big bang, but where we can move materially. Another 6 years of lost growth, of lost productivity, would not just be disappointing for future generations. It would be irresponsible on our part. But the experience of this year also gives me confidence. It has shown that the economy has strength, is resilient. What is happening between France and Germany is a sign that between two large member states, cooperation can work and can be a momentum for many others to follow suit. And there are conspiracy of the willing to actually try to deliver and identify on a pilot basis what can actually move and shift. They don't require new treaties. No radical rewiring of unions, just a political will to use the tools and the cooperation between the policymakers and those who will actually benefit from those policies. If we can summon that will, Europe can move from being merely resilient to being genuinely strong. And when we bash our head against the wall, as I do occasionally when I try to move the project of the digital euro with my team, which I contend is not a disintermediation of the banks as opposed to other products, but requires the intermediation of the banks and contributes to Europe's sovereign autonomy. When I bash my head against the wall and go through the loop, let's not ever forget that it's the first step that matters, and that one step at a time, but fast, we can actually make sure that Europe is strong and is not the victim of decisions being made outside of this region. Thank you very much.
Christine Lagarde, que ha dejado un amplio discurso advirtiendo algunos de los principales riesgos sobre la economía de la zona euro, pidiendo de nuevo mayores medidas fiscales y de estímulos a los gobiernos, asegurando que no hay ninguna ventaja competitiva en prestar servicios dentro de Europa, asegurando también que hay que adoptar un enfoque más radical con la simplificación. Vuelve de nuevo Christine Lagarde a lanzar esta idea, la de esa alta regulación, de desregular, simplificar y, por supuesto, no perder el tren de la industria automotriz, de la industria aeronáutica, porque hay mucha pujanza y Europa ha dicho que, bueno, pues que puede ser muy vulnerable a países terceros y que se está quedando en la irrelevancia. Un tono bastante contundente de Christine Lagarde. Mientras tanto, vamos a intentar hablar de mercado, vamos a intentar ver cómo la industria de gestión de activos está haciendo movimientos, cómo lo está viviendo estos movimientos convulsos en las bolsas, sobre la inteligencia artificial, también en Bitcoin. Vamos a saludar a José María Luna, socio de Luna Sevilla Asesores Patrimoniales. ¿Qué tal, José María? Buenos viernes.
Buenos días y buen viernes a todos.
Bueno, cóctel perfecto. Esas valoraciones tan exigentes sobre la inteligencia artificial que ni siquiera han hecho que Nvidia pudiera cerrar al alza en Wall Street. Vuelven las dudas sobre el sector, datos laborales mixtos y menores expectativas de que haya recortes de tipos de interés. Los mercados, ¿crees que van a seguir con esta tendencia?
Pues muy probablemente, Noel. Seguramente los mercados, los inversores, que son los que al final construyen los mercados financieros, están en un sentimiento, desde mi punto de vista, excesivamente negativo, ¿no? Alguien ya comentó en su día que los mercados financieros se mueven como un péndulo, ¿no? Pasamos de la irracionalidad absoluta en cuanto a la euforia a algo, bueno, pues como la situación en la cual nos encontramos ahora mismo, una situación de miedo, de pánico, de confusión, de incertidumbre que supone de nuevo la vuelta a la volatilidad a niveles no quizás a los que se vieron en abril de este ejercicio, pero vamos camino de ello, ¿no? Y hay muchas dudas, no cabe la menor duda que los inversores, desde mi punto de vista, siguen prefiriendo ver el vaso medio vacío. Nosotros, ya te anticipo, que lo vemos medio lleno, ¿de acuerdo? Más que nada para situarnos un poco dónde estamos nosotros y dónde puede estar el mercado. Evidentemente nos penalizará seguramente en el corto plazo ahora mismo por la estrategia que estamos siguiendo, pero que no la vamos a cambiar, no vamos a adoptar una posición defensiva. ¿Y por qué? Porque vamos por partes. Las dudas en torno a la inteligencia artificial. Los resultados de Nvidia, que parece que, bueno, pues que nos traían vientos nuevos, vientos positivos para los mercados, cuando anuncian unos resultados brillantes, desde mi punto de vista, pero luego siembran dudas. Y volvemos de nuevo a la circularidad de las empresas, a que no es sostenible las valoraciones, a que no es sostenible la inteligencia artificial.